His view on Ukraine is there's a deal to be had with Russia. And there may be, but where does that leave Ukraine?
That was President Donald Trump. Well, it might sound a bit far-fetched, but what's really driving his foreign policy, and where do all of those ideas come from? Roger Boyes is the diplomatic editor for The Times and joins us in the studio. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I mean, people laughed at that speech, didn't they? They thought it was another sort of rambling exploration of lots of different, slightly random ideas. But there is a serious point here, particularly when we're talking about Greenland.
Yes. I mean, actually, I think almost all of his points were quite serious because he's the future president of the United States. But yes, I mean, it's about China. Largely it's about China. And you hear it in the sort of supposed footnotes of what he says about Panama. You know, there are two Hong Kong-based companies that control the entrance and exit points of the Panama Canal. And he's worried about strategic waterways, yeah? So someone has been talking to him, and he's then rebranded it in his way, you know, give us our canal back, yeah? Well, of course, just because the Americans built it doesn't mean they own it. But the wider, and the same with Greenland, basically he's worried that Greenland the Greenlanders will at some stage vote for independence, probably in April, it looks like at the moment. And then a country like Greenland with 56,000 people needs a patron. They can't stand the Danes. That's why they're going to vote for, because the Danes have sort of under-subsidized them and treated them colonially over things. So it could be that it turns out to be a choice, you know, between should our patron be United States or China, you know?
With a bit of Russia as well in there.
With a bit of Russia sniffing out, you know, on the north. Yeah. So you can see why he would want to do that as a defensive measure. And honestly, historically, buying Greenland, it sounds ridiculous, but they bought Alaska and got quite a good deal out of it. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, that was their greatest deal in history, really. You know, they've done it. They've expanded territory in the United States, I mean, quite relentlessly. And they've done it quite often without war, yeah? So that's the first thing. It's not just Trump craziness. There is a historical precedent for it. And it does in a kind of, we have to see now what's going to happen on China, really from January the 20th, whether he will delay a little bit on tariffs and hit China in other places at first. That's quite possible, and this is all part of that spiel, really.
One thing that did occur to me was he's obviously talking tough. He's obviously talking about national security. He's clearly concerned about China. Where, in your view, does that leave his approach on Ukraine? I mean, if he wants to be tough, can he afford to sell out Ukraine?
Well, he's already modified. You know, he said he'd do it in 24 hours. So, you know, next week he'd make peace in Ukraine. Well, he's already said, well, within 6 months. And he wants his view on Ukraine is there's a deal to be had with Russia. And there may be, but where does that leave Ukraine?
I mean, you actually wrote a piece saying you think Putin is in a rather weaker position than we all think.
Yeah. I think that's the case. And I think that's what he thinks. And I think that's why he thinks there's a deal to be done. If it was all, you know, stomping Putin, you know, getting what he wants, then a deal would be less easy for him to strike. There's all sorts of talk, especially with the tech bros that he's got around him, of what can be done with the reconstruction of Ukraine in terms of, because what they argue, people like Musk argue, is that, you had 70 years of communism, which wrecked the Ukrainian economy, and then you had 30 years of corrupt oligarchs. And what you need is, and the Zelensky is in some ways, beholden to them. I don't know whether one agrees with that or not, but it's certainly an argument. And so they're saying, well, let's make it into a high-tech country,
Do you think that if there, I mean, there are rumours that a deal is very close to being done. I mean, we saw President Macron over here visiting Keir Starmer about 24, 48 hours ago, suggestions that some of that conversation was focused on what happens next with Ukraine. Do you think that President Zelensky stays in post if and when that deal is done, after it's done?
No, I think he goes. And the first priority is to make sure that Russia's candidate doesn't get in.
Yeah.
I think Zelensky goes out of choice, and there'll be some kind of collective leadership with a tech element.
And do we have a suggestion about who the new leader might be and how big a part potentially Donald Trump may play in that?
No, it's difficult. With the Trump factor makes it very difficult. Very difficult.
And where do you think it would leave EU membership or indeed NATO membership?
Well, I think both would probably be off the cards. But Ukraine will be dependent probably, or what's left of the Ukraine after the agreement will be the subject of bilateral security agreements perhaps with the United States, or certainly with a group of willing countries, including perhaps France and Britain. What that security commitment is, it remains to be negotiated. It depends what happens, whether Crimea then, for example, automatically goes to Russia in a peace agreement or not. But either way, you can find ways of protecting Ukraine, as we have done for the last 3 years, and perhaps doing it in a more subtle way than NATO membership, which we know is a red rag and which will just freeze everything into some weird, never-ending, forever war.
And all these things we've been talking about, are they actually going to happen, do you think?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, South Korea, this is what happened with South and North Korea, that basically they had an armistice. They fought themselves into a standstill, and everybody wanted out, really. And then you got a demilitarized zone between the two areas where, in this case, where the Russians are in control and the Ukrainians are quite firmly established. So, and then you'd have a demilitarized zone, which would be then policed by who? Well, UN perhaps, but perhaps somebody like France and Britain. And this is kind of the thing that's being sniffed around.
And partly why Donald Trump is advocating for far more to be spent on defence from both of those countries. In the years ahead.
Yes.
Roger Boyes, diplomatic editor for The Times. We could spend another 15, 20 minutes, maybe another hour actually, just going around all the conflicts of the world with you, but we won't keep you. Thank you so much for your time.